Okay, guys, we're getting there. We are going to finish the circulatory system with this last video, but then we've got to have, I think, 2 more videos in the respiration and gas exchange part, but they won't be quite as long as the circulation section. So we're going to talk about blood pressure, blood, capillaries, and lymphatic system. I'm leaving a lot of details out for blood pressure, but if you guys have questions about blood pressure, like how it's measured and all of that, you can ask me during the online meeting. All right, so I'm trying to move this to a place where it's not going to be in the way. Here, right there. Okay, so blood pressure is essentially how much pressure is being put on the different vessels by the blood that's being pumped by the heart. So remember that the aorta is the closest vessel to the heart that is carrying oxygenated blood through the whole body. Okay, so the aorta is really close to the heart and it has the highest blood pressure because it's closest to where the most intense pumping is. As you move away from the heart, particularly in the systemic system, then the blood pressure, or the amount of pressure that the pumping of blood puts on the vessels, decreases the further away you move from the heart. So arteries are still pretty close to the heart. They show up right after the aorta, so they have pretty high blood pressure. But veins have really low blood pressure. One reason is that they are far away from the heart. They're returning to the heart instead of going away from the heart. And also veins occur after blood passes through these capillaries. And you can imagine that once blood separates into all these different vessels, it loses a lot of velocity and pressure as it moves into smaller and smaller vessels. So by the time it's at the end of a capillary, blood pressure is really low. So veins have much lower blood pressure than arteries do. And because of that, arteries and veins are actually really structurally different. Arteries are structured in a way that allows them to handle high blood pressure, and veins are structured in a way that allows them to get blood back to the heart, even though the blood pressure is pretty low. If you look at this is probably the most important component here. This is just showing the level of blood pressure in the aorta. It's the highest, and as you move away from the heart, arterioles, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, etc., back to the vena cava. So the lowest blood pressure is at the places just below or just before it reaches the heart again. So let's talk a little bit more about the structure of the arteries and the veins. We're going to talk more about capillaries in a little bit. But arteries, remember, they have the higher blood pressure, and they have thick, strong, elastic layer right here, which helps them deal with the high blood pressure of the blood being pumped through the vessels. Okay, the veins don't have the same. You can't really see actually how the difference in the thickness of the elastic layer, but the veins have a less thick elastic layer because they don't need it to withstand the high blood pressure. This elastic layer makes sure that the arteries don't burst with high blood pressure. Okay, so they have a thicker elastic layer than veins do. And veins don't need that thick elastic layer, but what they do need is they need valves, which is going to keep the blood flowing in the correct direction. So I'm going to show you some of that in a second. I'm just going to point you to the fact that capillaries are very thin. They are just one layer thick, and that's going to allow for exchange with nearby cells. So as I mentioned before, the capillaries are where all the exchange of materials occurs. Okay, so now looking at veins a little bit more. Remember, veins are where the blood flows after the capillaries. It goes to the venules and then the veins, and then it has to return to the heart. So if you think about blood going to a capillary bed in the leg or in the foot, let's say, And now at the other side of the capillary bed, you've got to travel back through veins, up the leg, back to the inferior vena cava. Now this blood's got to work against gravity, and it's got really low blood pressure because it's just been through a capillary bed and it's really far away from the heart, which is the thing that's pumping the blood forward. So the way veins manage that is they have valves like this that open and close, and when they close, it prevents the blood from flowing back down the vein in the opposite direction. So basically what happens is your muscles contract, and that while this is closed, this valve is closed, and that pushes blood up, and then this little valve will close, and then another muscle will contract, and that will push the blood up again. So you've got these involuntary muscle contractions that are actually moving the blood up the veins back towards the heart. And that's one reason why when you're on a plane, it's good to get up and move around so that you are actually helping those muscles move all your blood back into your heart. When you have problems with the valves within your veins, that causes something called varicose veins, which you may have seen before. Happens a lot to old people, but not only old people. So if there's some kind of misfunction in the valves of the veins, and sometimes there's genetic reasons for that, you end up getting these pockets of blood because the blood's not able to move in the right direction. So those are called varicose veins when the valves are not working right. Okay, so now we're going to talk about blood and specific functions of blood and different types of components of blood. First of all, if you're just looking at the blood that's found within the vessels, this is what it is made up of. First of all, there's about 4 to 6 liters of blood, which is a lot. That's a lot of blood that you are carrying around within your vessels. All of it's contained within vessels. 45% of that blood is made up of cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, which I'm not really sure are considered cells, but they're cell-like. And then 55% of the blood is plasma, which is mostly water, but there's also dissolved molecules in there. And so the plasma is sort of the liquid suspension that the blood cells are floating in. You do not need to know all of these different types of cells that are found within blood. But I do want you to know that the red blood cell is this one. It's called the erythrocyte. Its function is in carbon dioxide and oxygen transport, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. These neutrophils, eosinophil, basophil, monocyte, lymphocytes, these are all white blood cells, which we've talked about in terms of the immune system. And you don't need to know what each of these things are. Just know that the blood contains red blood cells, white blood cells of lots of different types that are involved in the immune system, and platelets. These platelets are used for blood clotting. Okay, so they're a sort of cellular component in the blood. Now we're going to talk specifically about the red blood cells, or the erythrocytes. They are the most numerous type of blood cell type that is in the blood. They are formed in the bone marrow, and they can a single blood cell, red blood cell, can circulate for up to 4 months in your vessels before they are basically recycled, removed by the liver. They have a biconcave disc structure, which means they are sort of disc-shaped, but they are concave on both sides, almost like a donut, but the hole isn't all the way poked through. This structure actually increases the surface area to volume ratio, which helps with gas exchange since that is their main function. Okay, if you were to look at a single red blood cell, here's that biconcave structure. Red blood cells contain a whole bunch, several hundred hemoglobin molecules. And hemoglobin molecules are the molecules that actually help them transport oxygen. And I think the next slide shows this a little bit better, but they're made up of multiple chains, yes. So multiple protein chains, 4 of them. And I don't care if you know what they're called, alpha chains and beta chains, that doesn't matter. But you should know that each molecule of hemoglobin has 4 of these little things called heme groups. And these heme groups are what bind the oxygen. Okay, so that's why you need to know. So every hemoglobin molecule can bind 4 oxygen molecules. And remember that each blood cell has hundreds of hemoglobin molecules. So that's how they bind oxygen into the blood cell, the red blood cell. So when the red blood cells are in the lungs, for example, remember they are laden with carbon dioxide. They've got to get rid of carbon dioxide and they need to pick up oxygen. So all of this is showing is the red blood cells that don't have a lot of oxygen, they're picking up oxygen in this diagram. So each of these is a hemoglobin molecule. Here's oxygen that's found in the lungs. Here, the oxygen has bound to the hemoglobin molecules. And when the blood goes through the systemic circuit and gets into a capillary bed in the systemic circuit, then the oxygen is released into the tissue cells. So it's bound to the oxygen. The oxygen is bound to the red blood cells until they get into a capillary bed where they need to release the oxygen to the tissue cells. So some of you have probably heard of sickle cell disease, maybe all of you. Sickle cell disease is caused by a single point mutation which causes abnormal hemoglobin proteins. And what happens in sickle cell is the hemoglobin proteins form these aggregates or groups, and that can deform the shape of the red blood cell into something that looks like a sickle, which is sort of like something that you would use to cut vegetation or something. Okay, so that's what the sickle cell name comes from, is that it's shaped like a curved sword, which is called a sickle. And when that happens, first of all, the red blood cells become not nearly as good at carrying oxygen, and also they can rupture because they become so misshapen. And not only that, but they can't move through the blood vessels as well, and they can block blood vessels. So people that suffer from sickle cell disease often are really fatigued and they have a lot of pain, and especially when exerting themselves or in places with high elevation where they need more oxygen, they're not able to get as much oxygen as they need. And so it can actually kill you if you don't have any normal red blood cells. Okay, this is again something that we've talked about before, but I just want to reiterate it because now we're going to spend some time talking about capillaries. So remember that arteries are carrying blood away from the heart. In this case, we're looking at oxygenated blood that's going into the systemic circuit. And then blood will flow into these branches, smaller branches of the arteries called arterioles. And from there, they will go into capillary beds. And remember, the capillaries are really, really thin. They have basically one layer of cells called the endothelium. That's it. And so besides that, they're exposed to all of this interstitial fluid. After the capillary bed, and by the way, this is where all the exchange is going to take place. After the capillary bed, they're attached to small veins called venules and then back to the vein. And this blood is now deoxygenated and it's going to go back to the heart, which will then pump it to the pulmonary system so that the blood can become oxygenated again. So let's talk specifically then about capillaries. This is that figure I showed you before, but with the arteries and veins sort of faded out. And again, this is one layer of cells, the endothelium, and each you can see the individual cells here, and that's a nucleus. So this is the capillary. Capillary is the site of all of the exchange between the blood and the body cells. And capillaries run through your entire body so that not any of the cells are very far from a capillary. They have low blood pressure, not quite as low as veins, but they also have really low velocity. And that is because they are divided into multiple, like a whole bunch of different tiny little vessels, which slows down the flow of the blood. So the reason why they need to have low velocity is because that facilitates exchange with the other cells that are close by. This figure right here is showing a capillary. It's showing two cells, two endothelial cells. Here's one right here, and here's another one. For this one, you can actually see the nucleus. And here's the inside of the capillary where the blood cells would be. Here's interstitial fluid. So this is the area where there's some liquid that's surrounding the vessel, and then here are the neighboring cells. So you can see that there can be exchange between what's inside this capillary lumen, which is an opening, and with these neighboring cells. Whatever has to be exchanged either has to move across this endothelial cell, or sometimes they can move in between the endothelial cells, and we're going to talk about that next. So there are three different ways that material can be exchanged between blood and tissues. Remember, the blood is going to be in here in the capillary lumen. The first one is diffusion. And that's the one we spent the most time talking about. Diffusion is what's used for oxygen and carbon dioxide to move from one cell to the other because it can diffuse across the cell membranes. So carbon dioxide and oxygen might be, or oxygen might be attached to the red blood cells that are inside this lumen. When you're in a capillary, when the blood cells are in a capillary, they are able to release either the carbon dioxide or the oxygen, depending on where they are, and it can diffuse across this membrane of the endothelium, across here, this other membrane. They can move through this interstitial fluid and can then move across the membrane into muscle cells. So that's all through diffusion. Lipid-soluble hormones can also do that same thing through diffusion. Secretion is just what it sounds like. I'm sure you learned about secretion in cell and molecular. In that case, vesicles in the endothelial cells, so like these little guys, can pick up materials by endocytosis that were in the interstitial fluid or within the lumen and move them across the endothelial cell into the other side. So they can either pull materials into the lumen or they can move materials out of the lumen using endocytosis and exocytosis. And finally, filtration is when material is moved through these little clefts in between the cells. So water and small particles can actually move in between these cells depending on how much pressure there is inside the capillary. But usually those clefts are way too small for proteins, especially large proteins. So you can only move really small things through there. Oh, and here's a better picture of the cleft, so you can see there is some space. So because we were just talking about filtration and the size of the cleft, I want to make a little statement about the blood-brain barrier, which you may or may not have heard of. But the blood-brain barrier is basically that there's a lot of things that are in your blood that can't not pass to your brain because of the blood-brain barrier. It's hard to say. So, and all that means is that the endothelial cells of the capillaries are really tightly packed, which means that not much material can move from the blood vessel into the brain. And that's to protect the brain from getting materials in there that need to not go there. So, for example, waste materials that might be being carried around in your blood. So there's very little filtration in the blood. But in the liver and kidney, where you have to remove a bunch of wastes from the blood, and we're going to talk about those in the next chapter, the endothelial cells have large spaces between them, And so there's a lot of filtration that occurs there. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about how filtration occurs and what happens to the material that's lost out of the capillary through filtration. So filtration is going to depend on the balance of blood pressure. So remember, that's how much pressure is being put on the cells of the vessels. In this case, we're talking specifically about capillaries, because remember, when we're talking about filtration and blood pressure, if there's a lot of blood pressure inside the capillary, then that's going to push materials out through filtration into the interstitial fluid. Okay, so blood pressure forces water out of the capillaries, but osmotic pressure brings water back into the capillaries. So osmotic pressure, I don't know that we've used that word before, but it's sort of like water pressure. Okay, so if water is being pushed out through blood pressure of these capillaries, then you think about what's left in the capillaries. There's a bunch of cells, there's platelets, there's proteins, and a bunch of molecules, and the interstitial fluid is made up mostly of water. So water is going to want to move back into the capillaries. So that's the osmotic pressure that is basically forcing water to move back into the capillaries after blood pressure has pushed it out. Okay, so you get a lot more blood. In many cases, you get more blood pressure or blood pressure pushing out more water, and some water coming back in through osmotic pressure. But in this figure specifically, the net fluid movement is that water is lost from the capillaries in this section. Net water moving out of the capillaries into the interstitial fluid. And the reason we're giving you that scenario is because I also want to talk briefly about what happens to that extra water that moves out of the capillaries. Okay, so here we have some fluid is lost to the interstitial fluid, and it's going to enter the lymphatic system and eventually get returned to the blood. All right, so the lymphatic system is our second circulatory system. We have our cardiovascular system, which is a circulatory system, and we have the lymphatic system, which is also a circulatory system. While the cardiovascular system is a closed system, the lymphatic system is an open circulatory system. Remember what that was like in the insects, where they have some vessels, but not all of the material is enclosed within the vessels. So that's what our lymphatic system is like. There's some vessels where the material is moving through them, but then it opens up, and so some of that material is just flowing throughout the whole body. So the lymphatic system actually picks up the interstitial fluid, the extra interstitial fluid that is created through when capillaries have higher blood pressure than the interstitial fluid, and net loss of water from the capillaries goes into the interstitial fluid. Okay, so there's all this extra fluid there. The lymphatic system is going to pick that up and return it to the circulatory system, the cardiovascular system. So there is no pressure for flow, but besides that, it's like veins. So there's not a heart or anything like that that's pumping it. But essentially, when the interstitial fluid has high pressure, due to there just being a lot of fluid lost from the capillaries, then that interstitial fluid just flows into the lymphatic system here. Okay, so here's basically interstitial fluid is moving into the lymphatic capillary. And they have valves within the lymphatic system, but there's nothing pumping it anywhere, but it still does just go in one direction. One-way valves and muscle action move the lymph back to lymph ducts, and the ducts are basically going to connect the lymphatic system back with the cardiovascular system. So the lymphatic system picks up all this extra interstitial fluid that gets lost from the capillaries and returns it to the blood. But what it also does is it functions in the immune system, because in your lymph nodes you have a bunch of white blood cells, and the interstitial fluid that moves back into the lymphatic system then gets treated with all of the white blood cells that are hanging out in your lymph nodes. Okay. I think some of this is what I just said. The lymph travels in ducts to nodes where macrophages, remember that's a type of a white blood cell. You might notice that you've got lymph nodes on your neck. They're pretty easy to feel. They're right here. When you have a sore throat or you have a cold, a lot of times those get inflamed. That's because there's an infection and the white blood cells multiply, and they're there to sort of eat up all of the viruses or whatever it is that's causing your infection. So the macrophages engulf dead cells, viruses, and bacteria. And then the lymph re-enters the circulatory system through the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. So here's the right lymphatic duct entering the vein near the heart, and here's the thoracic duct also entering a vein near the heart. So that's it for the cardiovascular system entirely. So the next video is going to talk about the respiratory system and how all of this is connected.